I'm Heidi Haddad. I'm a professor in politics and the international relations program. And I want to start by posing a question to you, a rather weighty question. We live in this time of extreme inequality, both within countries and across countries. Climate change represents an existential threat to life as we know it at this time. And how do you see change happening? Sort of what institutions do you think are most willing and able to make this change for these issues and others? And I know, Pomona, we don't do multiple choice exams here, but I want to give you 4 options, right? Government, business, the media, or NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So I'll give you a minute to think about it. So I won't make you raise your hand to see how you voted, but if you are in any way representative of the larger American public, the plurality of you likely chose NGOs. So in 2018, the PR firm, public relations firm Edelman, did a large public survey, and they asked the American public, what institution is most likely to lead to a better future? And the overwhelming response for the American public was that NGOs, right, non-governmental organizations, were that institution when they were given those 4 options, right? And this is not just unique to the US. So Edelman did public polling across 28 countries, right, and asked this question, and on average, NGOs are more trusted than government, business, and the media across those 28 countries. And simultaneous to this sort of trust in NGOs, there's 2 other trends that have been happening. The first is that NGOs are increasing in number exponentially, and especially since the 1990s, right? It's estimated that in India alone, there are 2 million NGOs. And the second trend is it's really happened most recently, is there is a tide of governmental backlash against NGOs, right? Those of you who read the news probably noticed that Brazil had a new president that was inaugurated earlier this month. On the same day that the Brazilian president was inaugurated, he signed what is widely considered an anti-NGO law. That law allows for supervision and monitoring of all NGOs in the country. And this is not unique to Brazil. Russia, Hungary, China, and India have all banned or restricted certain NGOs, particularly international NGOs, those that receive foreign funding or those that are working on causes that are seen as contrary to the state. And so the fact that NGOs are trusted institutions, they're increasing in number, and they're seen as threatening by governments sort of begs the question, what are NGOs? What are these organizations? And it's actually a very interesting question because there is no global standard of what constitutes an NGO, right? So we have global regulation on laws on many things, right? We all operate on the same time system. If you travel, you carry a passport book that looks the same, but there is no global regulation about what constitutes an NGO, right? The characteristics it has to have or the requirements of the organization to be an NGO. It is decided at the national level, country by country. So each country gets to decide what qualifies as an NGO. And in the US context, we talk about NGOs, but you don't register as an NGO in the US context. You register as a nonprofit, right? Or a 501c3, right, as a charity, right? That's different, it's sort of in contrast to Japan, where you register for an NGO, and the requirements are quite different than what it would be for a nonprofit, even in the US. So until very recently in Japan, you had to have the equivalent of $3 million cash in the bank to be an NGO in Japan. So if each country gets to decide what's an NGO, why are we even talking about this, right? How did this term come about, right? Why are people talking about NGOs? And it's sort of an interesting story. It's basically the story of UN jargon that goes mainstream, which doesn't happen that often if you know the UN and how many acronyms they use. But NGO is one of those terms of jargon that became mainstream. And the story originates back to the UN Charter in 1945. And in 1945, there were organizations that we would probably now characterize as NGOs that basically said, you know what? We want to have access at the UN, and we want to have access at the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, which is one of the major 6 organs of the UN, right? And they actually pushed for it to become one of the major 6 organs of the UN. And so states deliberated at that time. And they said, okay, right, we'll let you in, right? But we really think that you should have a second-tier status. We're not so sure about you. And we want to make sure that intergovernmental organizations, right? So organizations that are created by states, you can think about UNICEF, the World Health Organization, they should get more access than you, right? And so they created this term, non-governmental organization, that gave them a second tier of access. They could be where they could consult with ECOSOC, but they couldn't deliberate or vote, right? To basically say, you are not intergovernmental organizations, you are non-governmental organizations, right? And so if there is any sort of standard definition of an NGO, it comes out from the requirements needed to get consultative status at ECOSOC. However, it's important to note that you can be an NGO at ECOSOC, and you can be headquartered in a country, and you would not be recognized as an NGO there, right? So there's this potential discrepancy there. And ECOSOC basically has 4 requirements or characteristics to be an NGO, right, to get consultative status. And interestingly enough, 3 of them are negative, right? It's about what they're not rather than what they are. There's only 1 sort of positive characteristics. And the first is that they're non-governmental, right, which is fairly straightforward, right? They can't be under the direct influence of the government. They can't be a political party. But then you get to this question of funding, right, which has been a pretty contentious issue, right? So how much of your funding can you get from governments? And we know that humanitarian aid organizations get a lot of their money from governments. And so ECOSOC really hasn't taken a firm position on this. But there's this sense that you can only be an NGO if you can maintain yourself if government funding goes away. Well, what number is that? Is that 50% of your funding? 60? 20? And so ECOSOC, it has it, but it hasn't really made any determinations. And CARE USA, which is a humanitarian aid organization based in the US, gets 70% of their money from the US government, and yet it still has consultative status at ECOSOC. So that's the first sort of characteristic, is non-governmental. The second is that it's nonprofit, right? It can't be a profit-seeking organization like a business, but it can engage in commercial activities, right? You can sell merchandise, you can get paid for speeches, but again, it doesn't have to be registered as a charity. So a charity is, again, at the domestic level, right? A country, their tax laws determine whether you are a charity or not, right? So you can, again, have NGO status but not be a charity. And the last negative characteristic is that it has to be nonviolent. This is probably the most straightforward, right? And NGOs cannot engage in violence in any way, which means that they can't be terrorist organizations or criminal organizations, but they can provide services to those that do, right? And so you can think about MSF, Doctors Without Borders, right? They're operating on a humanitarian ethic, and anyone who comes to their clinic, they treat, right? And so sort of in Syria, they're treating rebels, they're treating ISIS fighters, and they're treating civilians alike, although they can still have consultative status at ECOSOC. And lastly, the sort of only positive attribute that you need to be an NGO at ECOSOC to get this consultative status is to be an organization, right? And what they mean by organization is that you basically have to have a headquarters, you have to have a director, and you have to have a constitution that has some basic of democratic principles within it. And they basically do this to differentiate NGOs from social movements, right? Social movements generally don't have bank accounts and hire staffs, and NGOs do, right? And if you really think about all these 4 requirements, they don't really tell you that much, right? It's not a government, right? It's not a business, and it's not a terrorist or criminal organization, right? And you're probably thinking, there's something missing, right? There's something missing in that definition. And thinking about how you might characterize an NGO, it's likely principles, right? You're likely thinking there's something more, and it's that NGOs work on behalf of principles, and they work on behalf of principles that are broader than their own as an organization. And that's likely true, right, in many ways. And even when we're talking about these principles that are broader than their own, they often talk about public good, public interest. You might think, yeah, they're working on behalf of the public good and the public interest. And that raises the question, what is that? And who gets to decide what that is, right? And so I want to give you an example. In 1996, a US-based organization that works to advance constitutional rights protection was granted consultative status at ECOSOC. So I want you to take a minute and think about what this organization might be. I'll repeat it again, a US-based organization that works to advance constitutional rights protection. So what do you think? And my guess is that many of you are probably thinking the ACLU, right? The American Civil Liberties Union, and you are right, right? However, there is another organization that fits this exact same criteria that got consultative status that same year, and it's the National Rifle Association, right? And so I think this illustrates sort of how contentious this idea of public good or public interest is, right? Both domestically and internationally. And this occurs even for what you might deem universal principles, right, in terms of human rights or religion, right? Those are also contentious at the international level. And ECOSOC has basically punted on the issue of principles, right? They don't mention it, right? They didn't mention it for a really long time, and then they kind of came up with this idea that says, well, okay, we know that there's something about principles, but you just can't work contrary to the principles of the UN Charter, right? But no NGO or an organization has never gotten consultative status because of the principles on which they work. They're mostly excluded for the other reasons. And so in sort of going back to the Edelman poll, where NGOs are these sort of trustworthy organizations, I really want us to consider why we trust them, right? Do we trust them because of what they're not? Do we trust them because they're not businesses, right? That they're not government, that they're not the media, and we don't necessarily trust those? Or if it's based upon their principles, then we really need to think about the potential for change, right? The potential for transformation that NGOs have that makes them trustworthy and potentially threatening, that works on behalf of principles that we agree with, right? But also for those in opposition. So thank you.